All right, so hello everyone. We have the one and only Stephen Kershnar, and so we're going to be talking about dessert mostly. So, Stephen, you say there are three reasons not to believe in dessert. What are
Yeah.
those three reasons?
So, first of all, I really appreciate your having me on my show. I greatly appreciate it. And second, just a brief caveat: everything that I discussed is my own opinion. It does not reflect that of any group or employer with which I'm associated. Okay, so dessert. I mean, we're all familiar with dessert. We say things like, "This person deserved better treatment from her spouse," or "deserved better treatment from the job," or "deserves more money," or "didn't deserve that punishment." Um, and in philosophy, dessert seems to do all sorts of work. For example, we standardly think that some people deserve a certain amount of income or a certain amount of wealth, or we think someone deserves to be subject to violence based on unilateral aggression. Religious folk oftentimes think that some people deserve to go to hell. Uh, Commonly, we think that people have to deserve a certain punishment in order for it to be fair or just. And oftentimes, people think that you can go to heaven or hell, heaven in particular, only if you deserve it in some sense. You're properly connected with God. In the context of consequentialism, we often think that, look, even holding the amount of well-being or utility fixed, it's better if saints are happy and sinners sad than the opposite, than that sinners be happy and saints sad, even holding things constant. We think that utility monsters, individuals that get far more utility from stuff than the rest of us, shouldn't get all the good stuff, even if it's going to produce more utility. And the repugnant conclusion, which comes from Derek Parfit, which says that it's better to have an enormous sum of people, let's say 1,000 billion people whose lives are barely worth living, that in terms of total utility, that's better than, let's say, having 8 billion human beings who are quite happy. Um, we often think that there's something wrong with that. Dessert promises a solution to all of these. Unfortunately, I think we have good reason to believe that people don't deserve anything. That is, there is no property that is dessert. Either that, or a different way to put it is, there is a property of dessert, but doesn't refer to anything in the world. Okay, one is when it comes to what dessert is, the nature of dessert. It's very murky as to what dessert is. And even the best books on the topic don't seem to give us an account, an analysis of what dessert is. Second, when we ask people what grounds or justifies dessert, oftentimes there's no adequate solution, right? So when we look at what it is that makes people deserve things, the ground or justification, I'm going to use them interchangeably, there's no plausible account. And third, when we look at the content, that is, what is it that people deserve, assuming that there is such a thing as dessert, and assuming that something justifies it, when we try and determine what it is that people deserve, there's no adequate account of that. So I very reluctantly and painfully, because I want to use dessert when I talk about things in my personal life. A lot of my early professional life involved dessert. So I really want there to be dessert. Unfortunately, there is not. So, thank you.
Yeah. So on the first point, so what is the reason to think that there isn't a good account of dessert, or is it just sort of you go through the various accounts and show that none of them work?
Well, here's the idea. Why is there no account of dessert? Dessert, we say, okay, what is it to deserve something? Well, presumably that's going to be either the property of the right, that is what ought we to do or not do, or the property of the good, what makes the world a better or worse place. Well, it's pretty clear it's not a property of the right. If you think about perfect duties or duties one person owes another, think of these in terms of Hofeldian relations, right? Does one person owe a duty to another? Or does one person have a power, a Hofeldian power, to change a moral relation with another? Or some combination of these? The fact is, we think of those in terms of rights. And you can have a right to something without deserving it, and you can deserve something without having a right to it. So let me give you an example of each. And this is in the context of non-consequentialism. You might think morally, if someone gives you a gift, if you have an uncle gives a ne'er-do-well nephew a gift, the nephew has the right to it, a moral right to it, well, as a legal right to it, but he doesn't deserve it. Alternatively, the uncle's daughters, who might have been, loving and wonderful daughters, they might deserve the uncle's inheritance, but not have a right to it. So it looks like when it comes to rights, or more generally Hofeldian relations, we think that a person can have a right to something without deserving it, deserving something without a right to it. Now, there can be imperfect duties. Maybe you have a duty to give to charity, but it's not owed to anyone in particular. But this is not the sort of thing that we think about when we talk about desert. Desert is very specific in terms of to whom, who deserves what, and what they deserve. Now, also in terms of the right, thinking in terms of consequentialism, we tend to think, okay, well, under consequentialism, the right maximizes the good. Really what matters here is the good. So if desert counts, it counts towards the good. Okay, well, that's not a theory of the right, except for indirectly. So we might think, okay, desert is a theory of the good, and that is a contemporary theory that you see in theories such as you see in Thomas Herka or Fred Feldman or Shelley Kagan. You see desert coming in as a feature of the good. Problem is when we say, well, what sort of feature of the good is it? On one account, it's like a non-linear relation. So if we can imagine the lower axis, the x-axis in terms of well-being, and the vertical axis, the y-axis, for example, in terms of intrinsic goodness, you might think on a standard welfarist account where the good consists of and only of well-being. It's just a linear relation. So maybe you think, okay, desert is a non-linear relation. That is, it's something which makes well-being not directly translate into intrinsic value. But the problem with this is that lots of things do that. I mean, some people think that beauty makes the world a better place, even if it makes no one's life go better. Some people think diversity of goods or of things makes the world a better place, even if it makes no one's life go better. So it can't just be a non-linear relation, because lots of things produce that aren't desert. It might be that desert is whatever we think the best account of it is, but that's not going to be good theory, because then what desert is the best conception of it. But how do we know we're talking about the same thing? We disagree about the best conception of it. Third, some people just think, look, desert is whatever grounds the good. But of course, that's just a theory of supervenience. I mean, pretty much any moral realist theory is going to view supervenience as being present. So in short, we ask ourselves, is desert a matter of the right? No, because of course you can have rights to things without desert, and desert to things in theory without rights. And it's not a matter of the good. Well, what else could it be? It's a feature of the moral world. In short, when you ask someone, what is it to deserve something? There's no general and adequate answer.
Okay, so I think maybe there's some definition. I don't know if I have a good definition of specific desert. So specific desert is the idea that you deserve certain things. So you might deserve, you might deserve to own the house that you bought, even if you're a very vicious person, such that it's not like you don't deserve it on account of your virtue, but you deserve it on account of the things you do, and you deserve this specifically. Well, general desert is about a specific level of well-being you deserve. So we would say, like, Hitler deserved to have bad things happen to him on account of being a bad person. But so what would you make of the following account of general desert, where you say general desert involves there being a non-linear, involves there being the value of well-being being enhanced by a person's level of virtue, or diminished by a person's level of vice. So the more virtuous a person is, the more that enhances their well-being, and vice versa.
Good. So I like your count in the sense I think it's the most plausible count out there. The problem with it is that one, this just assumes by the very nature of desert that you can't have specific desert. But we have to argue for that. We can't, this would make the following claim incoherent. I think there is special, specific desert. Well, if desert just rules it out because it's general, then we don't even get to that issue. But second, if you might think that, look, it just means that it enhances or diminishes well-being, so we want to know, is that, yeah, so I guess I just think, look, this rules out specific desert. But also, you might think, is this the only way that something can enhance or diminish the value of well-being? consider a theory that's different from totalism. We just average up people's units of well-being, and averages, and we just average people's levels of well-being. Consider a diminishing value theory that says each person's well-being adds fewer units to the total amount of goodness than the person who came before. Well, that also seems to enhance or diminish the value of someone's well-being, but it's not a desert theory. So I think your account has two problems. It automatically rules out specific desert, and second, it rules out things like diminishing marginal value theories of goodness that are not desert theories.
Yeah. Well, so you might think. So I don't. I think if a person did sufficient conceptual analysis, maybe they could figure out some good definition of specific desert. And if that's true, your definition of desert could just be you just give the definition of specific desert, and you say desert is that, or, and then you give the definition of general desert in terms of the first story. No, maybe it's the case that there just isn't a suitable definition that could be given of specific desert, but I don't know. It seems like maybe there could if we thought hard about it. And then in terms of the second point, so the account says that desert involves a person's level of virtue enhancing or diminishing their level of well-being. And so on the account where there's diminishing marginal welfare, I'm not sure why the level of desert would enhance or diminish the value of well-being.
Well, desert might do so. The question is, so let me just say one thing.
Sorry, their level of virtue, I meant. It would enhance or diminish.
So let's just separate this two. So one is, could we do a conceptual analysis? I'm sympathetic to you. I tend to think, look, there's got to be some account of desert. The problem is that there really wasn't one out there, and it's hard to come up with one. I suspect the reason we can't come up with one is that there is none. I mean, note that people have been working on this theory for a long time, and it's been important to the way in which we view the world for hundreds of years, and yet we don't have an adequate conceptual analysis or even anything close. So in terms of your point, well, maybe virtue enhances or diminishes the value of well-being. I mean, that might well be true, but note that we can't build that into the very nature of desert, because we want to be able to ask the question, does virtue ground desert? And we can't ask that question if we analyze desert in terms of virtue or vice. That's a substantive conclusion we have to arrive at. So I have exactly the same intuition you do, which is that surely there's got to be some sort of correct conceptual analysis of desert. But I would point out that it's really, I mean, that there does not seem to be a correct one, and there certainly has not been one put forth in the literature. And even some of these great theorists, right? I'm a big fan of people like Joel Feinberg and Shelley Kagan, Thomas Herka, like I said, Fred Feldman. They do not have conceptual analyses of desert, at least not ones that are adequate. George Scher, fabulous professor out of Rice University, analyze it in terms of I think a three-part structure. But again, you can have three-part structures with regard to rights. There's nothing distinctive about desert in terms of the part structure. So the fact is, there simply is no adequate conceptual analysis for desert out there.
Yeah. So you suggested that this sort of assumes that that virtue grounds desert. I mean, I would think that just all accounts of desert will say that what determines what a person deserves, at least all accounts of general desert, is something like a person's virtue minus a person's vice. Are there other accounts that?
Yes. So there's sort of two sets of accounts, roughly. One is a virtue-based account, and one is some volitional-based account, which is going to be like a choice or an action. So they differ. Some of these analyses seem to give virtue-based accounts. Some of them seem to give act or choice-based accounts. The virtue-based accounts, I find it not to be plausible, and that's because they're based on manipulation. So imagine that you have someone who's, a perfectly pleasant junior at Berkeley, UCal Berkeley, like Patty Hearst is, and she's kind of a pleasant, nice person. And this radical Marxist group, the Sudanese Liberation Army, gets a hold of her and brainwashes her into being an absolutely vicious and horrible Marxist revolutionary. Would we think that she deserves to suffer because she's vicious? You might think, well, no, she's been manipulated. Well, I think that and by the way, there's an issue as to whether Patty Hearst was actually brainwashed. I don't want to get into that issue. Let's just assume that was the case. It seems that she's not deserving based on having a rotten moral character if she had no responsibility for it. Well, this seems to tell us that really what the dessert maker is something for which she's responsible. And that something's going to be a decision or an act. Okay, well, let's ask ourselves, is that a plausible basis for dessert? Well, I think there's at least 3 reasons that give this problems. One problem is if you don't think people are morally responsible. Okay? I do not think people are morally responsible. And that's an increasingly common view in the responsibility literature, although it's still a minority view. So if no one's responsible, then no one's deserving on this account. Number 2, if people are responsible for something, they're probably responsible for what they think, not for what they do. Why? Because we're responsible for and only for that which we basically control, that is directly control, and we basically directly control what and only what we think. So this means they're not responsible for stealing someone's goods, or for hitting someone, or for being a good spouse, or for being loving. Why? Because if these are extrinsic acts, we're responsible for and only for what goes on in the head. Third, if you thought that intrinsic value depended in part on what you deserve, so part on your well-being, but a part of what you deserve, there's a real problem with incompetence, right? What about, infants or animals or people who are severely mentally ill, individuals who are severely mentally ill? You might think, well, they're not responsible, so they have 0 dessert. Well, how do we handle 0 dessert, for example, in a dessert graph? So that's going to be a third problem. And then a fourth problem is if you think there's specific dessert. For example, if you think that people deserve, punishment or salary or love, there's a problem. What's the basis for that? The standard accounts are implausible. Things like, did you work hard? Did you sacrifice? Did you contribute to others' well-being? So, Matthew, just real quick, there's some feedback there's like some, not feedback, but kind of static on your side. Are you getting that?
Oh, I'm not hearing any static.
Okay.
Is it still there? My hand was on the mic's attached to my headset, and that might have been it. Is it still there?
Seems to have gone away.
Okay. Yeah. So I guess one other objection to the argument is that Michael Huemer has a nice paper called something and the failure of analysis, and the basic point is that it's very rare that we get a nice conceptual analysis that allows us to understand a term. He has a whole theory about why this is the case. But you look at, for example, knowledge, and philosophers have been debating, just endlessly what knowledge means. Haven't come across a good definition. And this is just true of a lot of terms. It's very difficult to provide a conceptual analysis of most terms, especially most complicated terms. And so you might think, look, if there are lots of things that we know exist, like knowledge, well-being, etc., where it's very hard to give a definition of them, but we still know they exist. Why can't we say the same thing about dessert?
Good. So I like the point. Michael Huemer is just an absolutely incredible philosopher, one of the most important philosophers in the world today, in my view. So always worth listening to. On this one, I'm sympathetic to him. The problem with dessert is not small disagreements, it's massive disagreements. So there's a real issue whether we're talking about the same thing. I mean, if you don't know whether dessert is a theory of the right or the good, that's a problem. I mean, this is not like, disagreements within the same zip code. These are huge disagreements. If you have massive disagreements about the ground of dessert, is it just what you think or is it what you do, intrinsic or extrinsic? That's, again, a massive disagreement. If we have a disagreement as to whether dessert is general, that is, you deserve, to have so many utils during your lifetime, or whether it's specific, you deserve X number of years in Attica, or you deserve the love of, Allison. these are massive disagreements. And in the case of massive disagreements, the need for conceptual analysis, or at least something getting close to the correct conceptual analysis, is important. So use the example of knowledge. Okay, so justified true belief might not be correct. Maybe it's not even correct if we add a defeasibility condition, but it's be roughly in the neighborhood. We have a pretty we have a pretty good shared idea as to what knowledge consists of. Desert's nothing like that. I mean, is desert a theory of the right or the good? Is it specific or general? Is the basis of it virtue or responsibility? I mean, we're just all over the map on these things. So I think there's a greater need of conceptual analysis, and I think we're farther away from it than we are in other things for which we don't have precise conceptual analyses.
Yeah, but you might think there are some topics where we can't do basically any conceptual analysis at all, but where we still have the concept. So there's an example Humor gives, I think, of magic. We are nowhere close to having a good definition of what magic means, and it still seems like there are some things we can identify as magic. For example, the spells in Harry Potter, and I think there. I mean, examples like this are sort of hard to think of off the top of one's head, but I think there are more examples like this. And so if there are things like this, what would you make of cases like that?
So I think your point's an excellent one. There's certain things that are just basic. We say what a person is. You might think that we can't define it. I mean, we just refer to it. And other things we might have disjunctive accounts. Like magic maybe means different things in different contexts. But here, I think the problem is really it's much more troubling because there's real debate as to what we're talking about. It's not even clear we're not talking past one another. So imagine that we're discussing dignity, and one person by dignity means a feature of the right, the other person means a feature of the good, and a third person means what grounds the right or good, something like autonomy or moral autonomy. I mean, what makes us think we're talking about the same thing? And then when someone says, look, dignity is just another good to be balanced on the list of good things, and another person says, well, no, it's a theory of the right, so it tells us what we ought to do. It doesn't even enter into the list of good and bad things. I mean, there's a real issue as to whether we're even talking about the same thing when we mention dignity. Desert, I think, is worse off than dignity. I mean, we don't know the category of morality, the right or the good. The debates over the ground are all over the map. And oftentimes we're talking about different things. When people talk about desert in the context of punishment, it's very different from the various graphs of desert that you see in people like, Feldman, Herka, and Kagan, right? Or Louis Poyman, for example. So I think that we're in an area in which there's just vast disagreement about what we're talking about, and vast disagreement about how it works. And I think past a certain point, there's a real issue whether we're talking past one another. And again, the analogy I would use is something like dignity rather than knowledge. I mean, are we even talking about the same thing when we talk about dignity?
Yeah.
I don't think we are. And I'm just skeptical of a lot of dignity talk, for example, for some of the same reasons.
Yeah. So I guess the last question about this argument is that, okay, maybe we agree with you. There's no good conceptual analysis of what desert means. We don't have a good definition. But you might say, okay, maybe there isn't a good definition of desert, all things considered, but there are still more specific accounts of desert, and you can defend this by appealing to the same sorts of desert-based intuitions. So, for example, we might have the intuition that things are better if Hitler suffers than if Gandhi suffers. And we say, okay, because we have that intuition, even if we don't have a definition of what desert as a whole is, we still might have a definite. We still maybe the different definitions of desert really are talking past, or the different accounts of desert really are talking past each other. But as long as there are still these accounts of desert that are fairly specific, then it doesn't matter if we have some holistic definition of desert.
Good. So I take your point, which I think is a really strong point, that look, maybe because our intuitions are tight enough and in enough agreement, we can do without a conceptual analysis, right? We say what Potter Stewart said about pornography, I know it when I see it. And we can arrive at conclusions with regard to desert just so long as we have clear intuitions about particular cases and about how they generalize. Okay, I mean, there what I would say is, I mean, then the other two problems kick in. What actually justifies dessert, and what is it? What is the object of dessert? That is, what in particular do people deserve? Um, but I'm worried about if we can't say what something is, then I worry that our intuitions aren't, kind of what they're hooking into. I mean, there could be other explanations of why we think it's better that Hitler not be happy. But I think your point's well taken. I mean, I think, look, maybe we can sort of have productive discussions even if we cannot conceptually analyze dessert. That is, even if it's not a basic or primitive term, and even if we don't have a conceptual analysis of it, still we can talk about particular cases, and that's all we need. Okay, perhaps. I mean, it threatens to make parts of the dessert literature talking about different features of the moral world, but maybe that's not something that should bother us. I mean, maybe we should just say, look, there are just different things that are sitting under the overall term of dessert, and we can just be more precise. So yeah, I guess I'm sympathetic to that. I just think there are other reasons as well to doubt whether people deserve things.
Okay, let's talk about your second argument. So, about whether there is a satisfactory ground of dessert.
Yes. So, like I said, as far as I think there are two plausible grounds of dessert, classes of grounds in general. One is the virtue-based account, which is fairly common, and that's oftentimes how we express it. And then there's the volitional-based accounts, and they really are different. Increasingly, I think the volitional accounts are more common than the virtue-based accounts, but both exist in the literature. So, and for example, you see the virtue-based account in sort of the brilliant work by Thomas Herka, and in work by, for example, Joel Feinberg and Louis Poyman, and in Fred Feldman, you see kind of a volitional-based account. So, take the virtue-based account. My claim is it just does not seem to be correct that when someone has a certain virtue or vice level, but they're not responsible for it, that grounds dessert. Again, I use the example of Patty Hearst. I mean, if someone is manipulated into having a very different psychology than they had before, it's really an odd notion that they deserve to suffer, for having this rotten psychology when they weren't responsible for it. And same thing with the positive psychology. I mean, imagine someone has a really virtuous psychology as a result of manipulation. It's a strange notion to think, well, a person deserves a really good life because they have, really loving attitudes towards good things, and they hate evil things. You're like, yeah, but they didn't choose it. They didn't control that. They're not responsible for that in any way. I mean, do you share my intuition on this?
I do. So, I mean, one thing you might think is that uh, you only you only get the things that determine your level of dessert are your level of virtue or vice only if you're responsible for them. I mean, you might think you are responsible for them if you sort of cultivate various dispositions that bring about your virtue over a long period of time.
It's an odd thing to put that intermediate step in there, though. Why not say, look, what mattered is what you chose, or what you did, what those acts you performed. I mean, why say that you're responsible for your virtue, but only if you're responsible for it? I guess I'm just not seeing what would motivate, either in terms of specific cases or theoretically, that intermediate step.
I mean, one worry is that I mean, I think the reason you might say that is you might just agree with your objections to the other account. You might think, look, there isn't a good account, according to which the thing that grounds dessert is the actions to take. One reason you might think this is, for example, that what actions you take depend on just various chance events. So if some serial killer had been paralyzed when he was 19, he wouldn't have done any serial killing. And so you say, look, because the if he was paralyzed, he would deserve better things, and that doesn't seem right. And so you might think that things that you deserve are intrinsic features of the intrinsic features of your character that you're responsible for, rather than the actions that you take.
You might think that. I guess I think once you introduce responsibility as a necessary condition for dessert, the more plausible thing is, well, dessert just is grounded by that for which you're responsible. That there's nothing gained either intuitionally or as a theoretical matter by putting an intermediate step. I hear what you're saying about the serial killer, but then you might think, well, that's going to get to one of my arguments, which is why I think dessert rests on what you actually do as opposed to what you think. So let me just proceed to the arguments against praise. So someone might think, okay, then what makes you deserve something is that for which you're praiseworthy or blameworthy. But here, so let me introduce two arguments off the bat and then go to the third argument a little bit later. One is if you don't think anyone's morally responsible, then no one's going to be deserving. And I do think the following entailment holds. If someone deserves something, then in some sense, he's responsible for the basis of it. That is, desert entails responsibility. So if there's no responsibility, then there's no desert. But second, what you are responsible, what you're deserving for, the basis of desert, is that for which you're directly responsible. That is, responsible for in and of itself. Well, what you're responsible for, I claim, at least basically or directly, is and only is that which you think. So other things, like let's say you take, and I'm stealing this from an excellent philosopher, young philosopher named Husserl de Meritus. Let's say that you shoot at someone with a gun and a bird flies in front of the bullet and prevents the person from being killed. Well, that's not under your control. It's not clear why that's something for which you're responsible. So that's more in general true, right? It seems that in general, things that occur outside of you or extrinsic acts are outside of your control. If you think there is a strong connection between that which you control and that for which you're responsible, then it's going to be a matter of and only of what you're thinking. That is, the basis of responsibility is only what goes on in your head. In addition, you might think that for which you're responsible for is something that's connected to you psychologically. That is, it has to flow or directly be connected to your psychology. But if that's true, it's not clear that extrinsic things are as closely connected to your psychology. So the upshot of this is the following. If responsibility internalism is true, then desert internalism is true. But if desert internalism is true, then we get really counterintuitive results. Why? Because we standardly think that what you deserve things for are things that you do in the world. Did you unjustly harm someone? Were you loving and kind for someone? Did you tell someone the truth? Did you work hard for this company? But these are things that all occur outside of your skin or outside of your head. But if I'm right, if responsibility internalism is true, and desert rests on that for which you're directly responsible, then desert internalism is true. And then you don't deserve things based on your extrinsic effects on the world.
Yeah, I definitely.
One thing, Matt, so there's a little bit of static back if you.
Oh. Yeah, I can try just using the microphone on my computer and not using my headphones.
No, we're good. It's gone down a bit. I'm just telling you that it's kind of on my end. It's pretty strong. I mean, it's not a problem as long as it's not a problem on your end.
Okay. Yeah. I guess people who are listening, can you hear static? So one of the three of you should say if you can. But okay. Yeah, so I definitely think that this was one of the most convincing arguments in the book, and I think there are going to be significant bullets to bite either way. I mean, I think maybe the least costly option is to say that is to just accept desert internalism and accept responsibility internalism. And say, look, part of the thing that explains our intuitions about desert is who we think ought to be punished. And who ought to be punished depends for obvious reasons on what people do, not merely on people's intrinsic dispositions. And so you might think that that there's sort of a explanation of how we would come to have these overly broad desert intuitions where we think that desert depends on what on what you do. but then we really end up just saying that as the fundamental account of what a person deserves, that would be internalist.
Yeah. And let me give you an additional argument, and then because it's kind of a strong argument, it's not terribly popular, but I think it works nonetheless. Which is that people are not responsible, and the argument is it's just a straightforward argument. It's when you say someone's responsible, there's got to be a basic responsibility maker. That is something in virtue of which a person is responsible. So, I mean, it can't be like an infinite regress of responsibility makers because there's nothing to add responsibility into the system, right? It would be like an infinite sequence of extrinsically good things. Somewhere along the sequence, there has to be something that's intrinsically good in order to give value to the rest of the sequence. It can't be a circular sequence of extrinsically valuable things. Again, because somewhere in the circle, something has to add intrinsic value into the system. By analogy, you can't have an infinite sequence of responsibility makers, and you can't have a circular sequence. Hence, you have to have something that by itself makes a person responsible. And by responsible, I think responsibility is actually a basic notion. We can't really analyze it, but crudely it means being apt for praise and blame. You see this in various accounts in the literature. So what are the two candidates for a basic responsibility maker? Well, it's going to be either a choice or it's going to be a psychology, right? Those are going to be things that at a basic level by themselves make you responsible. Well, it's not a choice because you're responsible for a choice only if the choice flowed from your psychology and you're responsible for that psychology. You're responsible for a choice only if that choice flowed from your psychology and you're responsible for that psychology, right? So if that's correct, then it depends on you being responsible for your psychology. So let me defend that principle. Imagine someone made a choice, but it didn't reflect their psychology at all. It was just a random or arbitrary choice. Well, it's hard to see how you could be responsible for a random or arbitrary choice.
Right, so that would just be like a, like an unexpected compulsion that just flashes in your psychology, just flashes in your brain. You decide to do it, and then 1 second before you had no plans to do it, and 1 second after you're like, why the heck did I do that?
Exactly.
Yeah, right. I share the intuition that that doesn't. You're not responsible for that.
Now, imagine that your choice flows from your psychology, but you're not responsible for your psychology. Again, it's hard to see you're responsible for your choice, right? So imagine, again, we manipulate Patty Hearst. So as a result, right after manipulation, she picks up an automatic weapon and helps rob a bank on behalf of these Marxist revolutionaries. Would we say that she's responsible for this choice because it flowed from her psychology? No. Why? Because she's not responsible for her psychology. Or imagine someone who, God creates someone from nothing. So you have like a full-fledged adult, right? And the adults are created from nothing, ab initio. And so a mere split second after the person's created, he does something terrible. Right? He does some horrible act. Would we say he's responsible for the choice to do that act? Well, no, because he's not responsible for psychology. So even if his act flowed from a psychology, because he's not responsible for the psychology, he's not responsible for the choice that flowed from it. And as a side note, that's true whether the choice flowed deterministically or indeterministically from the psychology. But the same thing's true of psychology, right? So we say, okay, are you responsible on the basis of, at a fundamental level, your psychology? Perhaps you can see this in the important theories of John Martin Fisher. But it's a little hard to see how this is the case. I mean, imagine your psychology formed through random and arbitrary acts, right? Just a random psychology formation. It's hard to see how you can be responsible for that psychology if it formed every bit as randomly as any other, event. Well, imagine that you chose your psychology, but your choice was manipulated, right? So someone manipulated Patty Hearst into choosing, a bitter, hateful, revolutionary psychology. Well, if their choice is manipulated, then the psychology which flows from it would not be something on the basis of which, at a fundamental level, they're responsible. So again, I ask you, do you think that what would be the fundamental basis for responsibility? a choice or a psychology, and it seems that neither is the fundamental basis of responsibility. But if we need a foundation, if we need a responsibility foundation or fundamental basis, or as I like to put it, a basic responsibility maker, and there is no basic responsibility maker, then no one's responsible. And if responsibility, if desert entails responsibility, and no one's responsible, then no one's deserving.
Yeah, I also find this argument to be very convincing. But I mean, so I guess, if I had to defend moral responsibility, I think what I would probably say is the following. I'd say that, what determines if it's really you doing it is if it flows from your psychology. What you are is basically uh, something like your psychology. If a choice doesn't flow from your psychology, it's sort of more analogous to a random compulsion, or to, if your muscles twitched and caused you to do something bad, no one would say you're morally responsible for that. Okay, so, and then I'd say that given that you're given that what you are is something like your psychology, um, the only things for which you're responsible for are the things that flow from your psychology, just like the only things you're responsible for are the things that you do, even if you're not ultimately responsible for your psychology.
And like I agree, it's a strange notion to say you're not responsible for your psychology, but you're responsible for what flows from it. I mean, it's a kind of a bizarre intuition there. But what I would say is, so, and then the third argument against desert, the ground of desert. So let's assume that people are responsible, so that you and I are not correct about this. And let's assume that responsibility internalism is false. So that we're not right about the view that you're responsible for and only for what goes on in your head. Still, let me ask, what is the basis of responsibility for specific, let's say, specific desert? Sorry, what's the basis for specific desert? It gets really strange. So imagine we say, okay, how much of the income does someone deserve? What determines that? Well, you might think the standard accounts in literature, are either that it's hard work, that for which, how much hard work you put in, how much you sacrifice, that is kind of the cost to you, or the contribution that you make to others. But these really aren't, these views are implausible. I mean, take hard work. Why do we care about hard work unless it's somehow a cost or a sacrifice to you, right? That is, hard work itself doesn't matter. Plus, you can work really hard towards evil enterprises, right? It might be that members of the Gambino crime family were hard workers in building their crime empire. It hardly seems that they have positive desert based on that. So we have to have something which gives it like a positive valence. But in any case, what seems to explain why we think hard work grounds desert is something like the sacrifice or cost to the individual. But why would we care about cost or sacrifice to the individual unless that somehow reflects how much praiseworthy action they use towards some goal? So they are returning back towards a praiseworthy action. We're moving away from sacrifice. In addition, you can sacrifice again toward evil projects, right? You might think that, to use the kind of the Nazi example, you might think, look, say what you want about Hitler. The man was hardworking and sacrificed quite a bit to push the Nazi projects. So, does that mean he deserves positive outcomes? Well, no, there's a negative valence there, right? So again, we need a valence maker. What about contribution? Well, the problem is that people can contribute negatively to others, even though they're doing praiseworthy acts, or they can do blameworthy acts. So people could do blameworthy acts and contribute positively, or they could do praiseworthy acts and contribute negatively. So here's an example I have in mind. Imagine someone develops this really good nail gun, right? Do enormous effort. That it's a great nail gun. It's really good if you do construction. So if any of you've done construction, you know that the hammering nails is tiring. It's inefficient, things like that. You do this nail gun, which is a lot more efficient. It's cheap and it's very powerful. But then people discover that because the nail gun, can't really be traced, it's a great way to kill people. So that, you got this nail gun being used for vast amounts of murder, but the person, so you have what? A positive act. You tried to do something good, right? Tried to design this positive thing, but it contributed negatively to people's well-being. or someone could have tried to contribute negatively to someone's well-being, right? They tried to develop something they thought would be really destructive, and it turned out to be really positive, right? They tried to send out a horrible message through their music, but it turns out people just love the music in and of it, by itself, ignore the message, and it really contributed positively. So again, when you think about hard work, sacrifice, and contribution, those don't seem to ground specific desert. Well, what about a praiseworthy action? Well, there's all sorts of problems with this, but one problem with praiseworthy action is it's not tied to specific outcomes. A lot of what we do in terms of praiseworthy actions only indirectly contribute to someone's, let's say, contribution to others' well-being. So take someone who makes really good investments in Wall Street and makes all our lives better by transferring resources to their most efficient usage. But he learned to make these efficient transactions through various developing of discipline, right? I mean, he was a weightlifter. He played NFL football, and he has a stable life. He has a stable marriage. He made good personal choices, and these all allow him to make more efficient decisions on Wall Street. Where's the boundary? I mean, where do we cut off? Where do we say your praiseworthy acts stop here, but not what came before that? I mean, all those acts sequentially lead to him contributing to our well-being. So when we think about what would be the grounds for specific desert, hard work, sacrifice, contribution, or praiseworthy act, none of those seem very plausible. There's also a severe problem with incompetence. We might ask, do people are incompetent, like the severely mentally ill, or people are cognitively disabled, or non-human animals? Do they deserve anything? Strange notion to say they don't deserve anything, and yet they don't seem to have any of the bases of desert. Either one seems to be problematic. If they don't deserve anything, you wonder what does their desert look like? Is it enhanced or diminished? Is it just a linear relation between well-being and intrinsic value? It gets very murky when we look at incompetence. And let me just give an example that shows up. Shelley Kagan has this really good book called How to Count Animals. Shelley Kagan's one of the leading desert theorists, but desert barely shows up in this book regarding how to value animals' lives. And you might think one of the reasons for this probably is that it seems that animals don't have a basis for desert, and yet it's hard to figure out how valuable their lives are if we can't say what they deserve or what it means to have zero desert.
Yeah. So, what if you thought the following? You thought that, let's say hard work in the pursuit of a goal that some rational third party with sort of a reasonable amount of basic information would expect to turn out for the best. That's what grounds desert. And so, if if you do something that you expect to be bad but randomly turns out to be good, well, you don't deserve the rewards from that because you did something that one would rationally expect to turn out bad, and vice versa.
Good. So maybe we'd say desert equals something like this equation. How about the amount of hard work times the reasonableness of the expectation that it would turn out well? Is that kind of what you're getting at?
Yeah.
Okay. So one problem with this is, why would we care about reasonable expectation unless it's something that makes your effort praiseworthy, right? It seems that we would care about your reasonable expectation only if it says that, well, you had a good heart, or you had a valuable goal, or something about what you were doing, was a praiseworthy or valuable. Well, this just seems to indicate that we're talking about a praiseworthy act. But second, why should we care about hard work? So imagine two people dig a ditch, and one person is doing it with a shovel, right? So it takes them, 3 weeks of back-breaking work in the sun. And another person has a backhoe. So he does it in an hour in an air-conditioned cabin, with rock music cranked. Well, they both contributed equally to our well-being. I mean, why think that the person who, was shoveling in the hot sun for 3 weeks is greater dessert than the person in the backhoe, like, and they contributed equally to our well-being. I mean, why does hard work by itself matter towards dessert, particularly when we're talking positive dessert?
Yeah, yeah, that's a good point. Um,
And this is particularly true if the person who did the backhoe just had like smarter planning or was just more intelligent and said, hey, rather than using a shovel, let me rent, from Jones Rental a backhoe, so there was even better planning involved. I mean, and you might think, okay, well, maybe it's, planning times hard work times reasonable expectation. But again, we have all these factors. What's unifying them? My claim is it's going to be something like a praiseworthy act.
yeah. So, okay, so maybe there's no basis for specific dessert. Maybe we have to give up on specific dessert. But what about general dessert? What's wrong with saying the basis is just, well, other than things we've already said
Yeah, yeah,
about the issues for general dessert? What's the problem with
yeah.
the objective general dessert?
So I think I have your intuition that general dessert's a lot more plausible than specific dessert, right? It's hard to say how specific dessert's going to work, but general dessert's far more plausible. And the idea is that somehow you deserve happiness based overall on, let's say, how virtuous you are, or your praiseworthy acts, the kind of sum total of praiseworthy and blameworthy acts you've done in your life. So somehow we like add them up and we say, okay, well, Matthew, you have plus 792 praiseworthy units, so you deserve a lot more happiness than Kershnar, who only has like plus 3 praiseworthy units. So that might be one way to go, or more virtuous, right? We could say, well, look, Matthew has 814 positive virtue level. Kershnar is kind of not as anything near a good person. He only has plus 4 virtue level. So Matthew deserves whatever
You
the.
were previously at a very high number, and then you wrote your book about why we shouldn't be grateful to veterans, and that just
Fair enough. Yeah, that's right, and that's yeah. So here's some problems with this. One is when we actually try and do the geometry of it, it's very hard to see how we do it in terms of geometry. But that we'd have to be more specific on. But more general, think about whether the dessert, the general dessert, is momentary. That is, does it occur in a moment? It is a growing block. That it does it is the basis of it. Whatever you've done or what your virtue level from the time you came to existence to the present, or is it a lifetime? Is a lifetime dessert? And none of these are very plausible. So take the momentary notion that your dessert, it depends on what's happening right now, and that your dessert levels right now and affecting your well-being at the time you're acting. But we standardly think that what you do now affects your dessert in the future. We say that Jones deserves the love of his wife because in years past he's been a really good husband. Okay, you lose that if you have momentary dessert. That is, if when you deserve things is different from the time of the basis of dessert. What about the growing block account? Well, it's an odd view that what is it that your lifetime your dessert up to that point in time, then what? It backtracks and affects your well-being earlier on. So imagine that you were really happy at age 17, in part because you did really nice things at age 19. I mean, does the basis of your dessert backtrack and affect the goodness of your happiness 2 years earlier? It's a strange notion, and we get a similar backtracking problem with lifetime dessert. So let's assume the future is open just for a simple model. So you could do good or evil things as you go through life. And at the end of your life, you start doing a ton of evil things. I mean, you're just really a rotten person. And so what happens? Then the value of your life, which came earlier, then gets diminished, even though that already occurred. It's an odd, you get involved in backtracking if you have lifetime or growing block dessert. But if you have momentary dessert, it gets strange, right? Because then you're only deserving at the moment in which you act. But we standardly think that what you deserve now depends in part on what you did in the past. So that's a concern. What's the time of dessert? And as I mentioned, we have the other objections, responsibility, internalism, and so on. But let me ask you, Matthew, if you don't mind asking, which view do you think is the best one of dessert? Are you a momentary theorist, a growing block theorist, or
Oh,
like?
sorry. I don't believe in dessert.
Oh, but
Um,
if you were to believe, what do you
oh,
think? You would,
uh, that's a good question. I mean, I think maybe I would just say maybe I'd be like sort of like a skeptical dessertist where I say, look, I don't know what the best account is of how we compare dessert over time, but there's got to be some account. Um, or I think maybe what I would say is that your dessert, the value of well-being at some time depends on what your level of virtue has been in the past, but not it doesn't affect what it'll be in the future. And so now maybe that I feel like that has weird implications where the temporal ordering of your life matters a lot in ways that are sort of odd. But maybe that's the least costly way to go.
yeah. I mean, but I guess my more general point is, um, it's hard to say. So you ask what's wrong with lifetime dessert. Well, that's one problem. That's what's wrong with it. It's that the time of dessert gets very murky. In addition to the other problems. So yeah.
Yeah, and one problem for every view other than lifetime dessert is they all violate the Pareto principle. No matter what your, no matter what your, like. So you might think there are two sort of different accounts of dessert. One of
Mhm.
them is retributivist, where you say sometimes it's good when bad things happen. It's actually good when bad things happen to bad people. The other one is I don't remember the name of it, but it says it's never good when bad things happen to people, but when bad things happen to bad people, that's that's less bad than when they happen to good people. Um, but any version of this, if you don't have the lifetime view, will say that sometimes you should make people's lives worse to benefit no one. The reason they'll have to say this is if a person, uh, so let's say that a person will be more virtuous later, and they're deciding whether to eat a cookie now or later, and later they'll be more virtuous than they are now, but but they'd enjoy the cookie more now. Well, on this account, because they'll be more virtuous later, they should eat the cookie later, even if they'll enjoy it less. And so, if you hold that how good something is depends on anything other than the lifetime total, then you'll get the view that you should sometimes switch around when you do things, even to benefit no one and make you worse off, which is a sort of odd result. But then I think the lifetime view is, it's just crazy. It implies that uh, if but your current level of virtue will depend on just what you'll do a million years from now with when you have just a totally different psychology and so on.
Right, and so the backtracking gets to be a pretty severe problem.
Yeah. No, I mean, retributivists will be happy just saying, look, we disagree with the Pareto principle. Sometimes you should hurt Hitler to benefit no one. But I think I'm pretty sold on the Pareto principle, and I think a lot of the non-retributivists, I think a lot of them are pretty sold on the Pareto principle, and so yeah. But yeah, I definitely. I mean, and I think this is true about dessert. That just once you start investigating, it's sort of this appealing idea at first, and then once you start investigating, it just turns up like just dozens and dozens of problems, and then you go one way, and that opens up a whole can of even more problems, and yeah.
I have exactly your view. That's exactly right. It's extraordinarily plausible when you start with it, and then like each additional analysis, it gets less satisfying. I think you make a really good point about backtracking. If you think lifetime dessert matters, then my happiness today, the value of my happiness today, depends on what sort of things I do, 40 years from now. So it's an odd view that you get to sort of backtracking and value. You also make a really good point about what to do with evil people. You get very strange results. Standardly, you want to say that it's not good that evil people suffer, because then it would make sense for God to bring in evil people whose lives go worse than zero, have less than zero well-being. But that doesn't seem to be right. It seems that if God is thinking about, should I create this person, Smith? Smith's going to have a negative well-being and a negative dessert level. You standardly, intuitively think, well, no, God shouldn't create him. I mean, his life doesn't go well. Smith's life doesn't go well for Smith, and it makes the world a worse place. But if that's true, then his life has to have negative value. And if his life has to have negative value, you wonder, well, what does that look like? Does it have a peak somewhere, in the bottom left quadrant where like the horizontal axis is well-being and the vertical axis is intrinsic value? Or, how do you graph out the intrinsic value of the lives of bad people? It's very hard to do, but it better have negative value, at least if they have negative well-being, because we want to say that God should not want to create people whose lives go poorly and who have negative desert.
Yeah. Two other arguments against dessert that I'd be curious in hearing your thoughts on. The first one is, what do you think of the evolutionary debunking accounts of dessert? Or not just evolutionary, but you say, so one of them is that if you just look back in our historical past, this is a point made by Bruce Waller, that it seems like dessert just developed from our desire to strike back at things that are bad for us. So, in Europe in the Middle Ages, if a dog killed someone, even if it was sort of by accident, they would kill the dog just because they. And so you think sort of dessert developed from those. And then also there's sort of a plausible evolutionary story of why, just for kind of game theoretic reasons, for why if you believe in dessert, sometimes you'll be better off because just for the instrumental reasons why punishing bad people is sometimes desirable. So what do you make of those sort of debunking accounts of dessert?
So I do think that those theories are probably not going to get us close enough to the contemporary accounts of dessert, which are parts of the good rather than the right. Because you might think that they're more tied to specific dessert, and the more common contemporary accounts have lifetime dessert. So they're general dessert rather than specific. So I'm not sure these evolutionary accounts align with our more recent theories, but maybe that's because the recent theories have gone beyond our dessert intuitions. I always wonder whether they come from something like, and perhaps it's an evolutionary basis, our estimation of dangerous individuals, that people of negative dessert are somehow dangerous and we shouldn't tolerate them. So perhaps that's right. Perhaps that's just kind of maybe it's just a good rule of thumb that we think of dessert basically as a rule of thumb with regard to who's trustworthy or who we want to be connected to or who's a good teammate. And maybe this does have an evolutionary basis. I suspect a lot of morality has an evolutionary basis, so I guess that would surprise me. But I guess I wouldn't be committed to it. I mean, I'm not sure what causes our dessert intuitions.
Yeah.
I didn't. There was no connection to evolution.
Yeah, and then I also think part of it is that just it's like we know that our emotions affect our moral judgments a lot, and it's just totally unsurprising that we have a negative emotional reaction to like things going well for Hitler, for example, on account of us having a very negative emotional reaction to Hitler, and for good reason. So, but yeah, I agree that these debunking arguments, they sort of undermine the force of our dessert intuitions, but they're not ultimately overwhelmingly decisive.
Yeah, I mean, I have to say, our intuitions, I find, are incredibly powerful behind dessert. I mean, it's not just saints and sinners. It's just when we get outraged at things, like someone mistreats us, and we get really outraged. We say, look, I didn't deserve that, right? Or you see an innocent person being punished. We say, he didn't deserve that. Or a guilty person, going free, and, he deserved to be harmed. And it's not just that I want to get even with the person, because we do have this sense of blameworthiness or not. If someone accidentally does something horrible, the person might disgust us or make us sick, but it's not clear that we kind of want them to suffer. So there was an individual who accidentally killed John Gotti's son. Apparently his son somehow drove out in front of the person's car. And you might think, okay, look, the person might have been completely not at fault. But we could ask ourselves, well, even if he wasn't blameworthy, would it be good for him to suffer? I think the answer, our intuitions here is no. I mean, he didn't do anything. I mean, he wasn't to blame. The fact that we're so worried about blame tells us these dessert intuitions are incredibly strong. And I think this is really true in our personal life, right? We get really outraged people do certain things, if people are sort of, unjustifiably violent, or if they're unfaithful in marriage, or if they're, full of hatred in their, unjustified hatred in their, relations with other groups. We just think, look, these people didn't deserve that. They didn't deserve what you did to them. And if you try and say, okay, well, try and go about your daily life without using the word or an equivalent of desert, it is really hard to do. So it tells you these desert intuitions, I mean, they really seem to be strongly held. And like I said, if you go through life trying to line up your emotions and your statements with your philosophical views, it's not easy to do, and that's fairly troubling. It's fairly troubling when you cannot align the way you think and the way you emote with the way that you think the world is.
I don't know how troubling that is. Um, I mean, so like suppose that um, you know, I mean, take one example. No matter what our view is of mereology, with maybe one exception, the things that we're going to think exist are going to be radically out of accord with the way we normally talk. So maybe we're mereological nihilists and we say tables and chairs don't exist, or we're universalists and you say tables and chairs exist and table turkeys also exist. So there's a composite object composed of my table and a random turkey in the middle of Argentina. Um, uh, I don't know. Like it seems like the fact that the English language makes talking in a certain way convenient, and we have and it's sort of useful to talk in a certain way. I don't think that gives us a great reason to commit to things as being part of the fabric of reality.
So I think you make a good point, but I'm not sure I disagree, and here's why. Imagine we had to, every time we talked with tables and chairs, we had to put in parentheses, well, really, I'm just saying, simples arranged chair-wise or simples arranged table-wise. You're like, okay, I'm getting most of what I want to say out of this, fair enough. It's not that much of a loss in terms of how we talk or think. Now imagine, I'm making this figure up, but 60 or 70% of the time you're outraged by what people do, or 80 to 90% of the time you're grateful for what people do. Like those are just not, like, you can't paraphrase them. You just have to drop. They're just out and out mistaken. That's just a huge loss in the way in which we think and act, and there's no simples arranged chairwise. So I think the cost here is massive and painful, in a way in which mereology would not exact the same costs.
Yeah, I'm sort of optimistic that there's going to be a way that you can paraphrase a lot of the statements about desert in a similar way. So as if you say, I didn't deserve to be treated that way. That can be paraphrased, and maybe this won't apply to all cases, but you can really get what you want by saying, look, it was very wrong to treat me that way, and it was unfair. And okay, I feel like that still gets you most of it.
But you can do wrong actions without blame. Desert seems to be just so closely tied to blame. Here's an example. So in The Good Earth, there's this wife, I'm probably going to mispronounce her name, but I think it's Olan. And, she's a good and faithful wife, hardworking, really, really sort of, and then her husband mistreats her. And we want to say, imagine this was real. What we want to say is, so what, he acted wrongfully toward her? But you can act wrongfully towards someone if you're not blameworthy. You might try and do what you think is best. You're just making a mess out of things. It's not really what we're getting at. It could be, well, he's blameworthy for doing that, but we want to say something more than that. We want to say, shame on him. He should suffer for this, or it'd be best if he were to be made to acknowledge his errors or apologize. That is, it should be not just is he blameworthy, but there should be consequences. I'm not sure wrong and right alone do it. And this assumes that we can have, amounts of wrongness and rightness, and maybe we can. I'm just not sure that that's going to get at what we want.
Yeah, I certainly think some of our talk, some of the statements we make will have to, the revision that we'd have to make if we didn't talk about desert would take some of the oomph out of our moral claims and would sometimes be out of accord with our intuitions. But
yeah, I mean, this is just a personal statement. I mean, I try going for just half a day without any like, explicit or implicit dessert statements or like accompanying emotions. I think you'll find that it's quite hard to do. So yeah, let me just make that claim. And so yeah, I just think it's in fact frustrating.
yeah, I can see that. The the second objection to dessert that I'd be interested in hearing your take on, and this is perhaps self-serving because it's my argument, but so for those who don't know, the argument against dessert is the following. So if we believe in dessert, we think that it's better when better things happen to good people than when they happen to bad people, and if bad things happen to bad people, that's less bad than when they happen to good people. Now, the problem is if you think that when bad things happen to bad people, that's better than when they happen to good people, then suppose a person's going to have lots of bad things happen to them. If making them morally worse makes the bad things happening to them less bad because dessert exists, then becoming a morally worse person would be a great thing. And in fact, let's say right now some great person is going to be sentenced to hell. And what you can do before he gets sentenced to hell is you can send him a copy of Mein Kampf. You can, get him to watch a bunch of Hitler speeches, and by the end of that, he'll be as evil as Hitler. It seems wrong. It seems like that wouldn't be good. And yet, if you believe in dessert, once he is a worse person, all of the units of his suffering become less bad. And so if he'll be condemned to hell for infinite years, then each of those units of suffering is less bad. And so not only would sending him the copies of Mein Kampf and the Hitler speeches, not only would that be a good thing, but that would be infinitely good as the amount of suffering he has approaches infinity.
Yeah, I mean, leaving aside the infinitely good part, I think you're right. It's like a leveling down objection. It's assuming your suffering is held constant. It's better that you make people worse off because it makes the overall scenario better. And that's true for both an individual and for a population. Yeah, I think that's right. And you could even have like less other versions of it. Imagine that a population is going to get way more, way less happiness than the person deserves. So this occurs to a person who has positive dessert and positive happiness. On certain accounts of dessert, it's better if they're, let's say, less virtuous or have less of a dessert ground because it's going to get them closer to what they absolutely deserve. Yeah, I think this is a really good objection. I mean, it just this sort of leveling down account. This would suggest that if for some reason God could not reduce the suffering in a population, he should make them more vicious so as to reduce the overall badness of it. But it's an odd view how the world becomes better if he makes them more vicious, or the world will be better if in fact they just were to make more blameworthy choices.
I do think that I think that there are sort of two related objections. One of them is the leveling down objection, which is that making the people worse is in some way good, and I think that has some force. But you might say, when you reflect on the cases, it doesn't seem obvious that it's not in some way good. It's like, before the guy who was being sentenced to hell was a great person, and there was this great injustice that was happening when a good person was being treated badly. But now there's at least some respect in which it's better, which is that the person's getting something nearer to what they deserve, and that doesn't seem crazy.
I hear what you're saying in terms of like the intuition that like if you have strong dessert intuitions, you're just getting a better fit between what they deserve and what they get. But it's just an odd view that the world becomes better when the only effect you're having is to make people more vicious.
And I think the case where if you have lots of suffering, where it makes each of the units of suffering less bad, then you get the result that not only is it a good thing, it can be good to any arbitrarily large degree. So it's like turning a good person into Hitler is more important than ending all other global suffering, and that seems nuts. Now, maybe one way to get around this is to say that, okay, look, the amount of suffering, like, okay, your first many units of suffering, their badness is diminished by dessert. So, like, if Hitler's first million units of suffering are less bad than Gandhi's first million units of suffering, well, Hitler's next infinite units of suffering are equal to Gandhi's next infinite units of suffering, or they asymptotically approach the badness of Gandhi's units of suffering. But the problem with that account is that suppose both Hitler and Gandhi both have suffered a lot, and you have to condemn one of them to 10,000 more years of suffering. Well, in this account, it doesn't actually, it barely matters at all, because above a certain point, their suffering becomes almost equally bad. So you either get the result that it's infinitely bad for them to become better, or that once they've suffered a lot, it doesn't really matter which of them suffers more. Both of these seem...
Right, so let me just separate these points out. I think they're really good points. One thing someone might say, the leveling down objection that you and I are raising, is that virtue is in itself intrinsically good. So the reason that God would want to make the suffering person more vicious is because vice itself is intrinsically bad, independent of desert. Now, I actually deny that. I actually think that what makes the world a better place is desert adjusted well-being, and not the components, right? Not the desert satisfaction itself. That has some value, the happiness is some value, and then the combination is some value, and we sort of add up the three things. The reason I don't think that's correct is I just think, look, we just don't know how valuable well-being is until we can discover how deserving the person is. So I deny that there's separate components that we add up. And in terms of the point about infinity, I mean, infinity makes everything go haywire. So imagine that, Jones is a really good person, and Jones is going to heaven, and heaven involves an infinite amount of positive well-being. Well, look, I mean, no amount of finite suffering will affect that. So should you and I walk around and punch people in the face? Well, I mean, that won't affect the overall amount of well-being, right? So, I mean, affect the overall well-being. It won't affect the overall amount of goodness. So, I mean, it's an odd view once you've maxed out. What happens if Jones is going to heaven and Smith is going to hell? So you have a positive infinity and negative infinity. Is that world good or bad? And the answer is, well, what happens when we add positive infinity to negative infinity? Standard mathematics does not allow us to do that. So the answer seems to be that there's no answer, and yet there seems to be an answer. I mean, it seems to be better to have, two people going to heaven and one person going to hell than two people going to hell and one person going to heaven. So I just think when we add infinite values, things just go absolutely haywire. So
I agree. Infinite ethics is weird, though. For this argument, you don't need infinite ethics. You just need an amount of suffering that's big enough to do the job. So it could be Graham's number of units of suffering.
I mean, you also have problems with what do you do with people who are get a lot more well-being than they deserve? So imagine someone deserves 10 units of well-being, but he actually has 2,000. I mean, does it asymptotically approach a limit? Does it just increase very slowly? Does it reverse itself and drop below the 0 point, so has negative value when his well-being has passed a certain point? I mean, none of these are very attractive. It doesn't seem like an approach to the asymptote, because it thinks that, we think that, look, when you have a huge increase in well-being for someone with positive desert, it should make at least some difference in how the world's affected. A sort of slow increase, it's hard to see how that's not going to be asymptotic. It need not be, but it's a little hard to know with that. And it can't break below the 0 point because, I mean, here's a very plausible principle. If someone has positive desert and positive well-being, then his life always makes the world a better place. So it can't drop below the 0 point in terms of intrinsic value. So it's a little hard to know how to handle these cases. But if we can't handle these cases, then it's a little hard to see how desert allows us to avoid problems with repugnant conclusions, with utility monsters, and things like that.
And I think that's right. The last question, and this is asked by Jonah in the chat, he asks, is the goodness of guilt evidence for desert? So, suppose you have a person who did something really wrong, and we're wondering, okay, is it better if this person feels bad about it, or feels like they did a great thing? So, would a world where Hitler felt bad about what he did, right before he committed suicide, would that be a better world than one where he thought, I did a great thing. I'm super happy about how things turned out, and was slightly happier in the first case, in the case where he doesn't feel guilt than in the other case.
Okay.
Intuitively, it seems like it's better for him to feel guilt than to be happy.
So that's a great question, but I think the answer to that is no, and here's why. If guilt matters, it matters either because it gets someone closer to what they deserve, or because it's virtuous. But virtue comes into play only through desert. So why should we want Hitler to feel guilty? Well, I mean, why do we care if he's more virtuous unless this affects his desert? And if we don't believe in desert, why is it better that he gets what he deserves? So I think the price of rejecting desert is very steep. It forces you to say, look, I don't want Hitler to feel guilty about what he did. And if someone thinks that's just atrocious, well, that's a good reason to preserve desert, or at least preserve the value of virtue. But I think the value of virtue is cashed out in terms of the value of desert. So I think the answer to that is no. And I think that shows just how incredibly distasteful and counterintuitive it is to reject desert.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I agree. I think, there's definitely a big cost to giving up dessert, but that the costs to accepting dessert are even greater.
Well, let me ask you this. Do you think in our personal lives, if you're like me, a dessert skeptic, do you think it's better to try and not think in dessert terms, or you just think, look, it's too hard to do that, or our lives go better if we think of dessert terms? That is, should we give up dessert thinking in terms of our personal lives? So let's say we're watching a documentary on the Nazis, and we're focusing on Hitler, and we have these really retributive emotions. We're like, God, I hope he suffered at the end of his life. I mean, should we try and correct that in ourselves, or we're reading about the good earth, and the first wife is really poorly treated, and what makes it such a beautiful book is we think, so undeserving, she deserved better treatment from her husband. Should we say, oh yeah, that's just terrible thinking? We should try and terrible things are strong. It's incorrect thinking. We should try and avoid that. So I guess my question to you is, do you think we'd be better off trying to remove dessert from our thinking, or we should just, when we're doing philosophy, reject dessert. When we run our lives, we're like 100% dessert theorists.
I think it'll depend on the details. Um, I think, if you're reading a book and like sort of ousting your dessert intuitions would sort of ruin the experience of the book, then you have no reason to do that. You deserve better than that.
Let me ask you more a case where it's not so just a matter of enjoying the book. Imagine you're a judge, right? So Judge Adelstein, you're able to track kind of proportional punishment better if you think in terms of desert, right? That is, you can give convicted criminals a more proportionate sentence if you think of them in terms of what they deserve. In that case, is it better to stick with dessert, or is it better to drop it?
Sorry, you said you'd give them a more...
Yeah, you're going to give them a more proportionate sentence. You might think that proportionate punishment is a matter of desert. Not in everyone's account. Some people think forfeiture theories can be proportionate without desert, but generally proportionality seems to track desert. I mean, that seems to be what's going on there. There are cases where we really want desert to come in. I mean, do we really want judges moving away from proportionality? I guess I have mixed views there, because no, I'm tempted to say I don't want my judges moving away from proportionality, and yet desert seems to justify proportionality, or if it doesn't justify it, it seems closely connected to it. I mean, perhaps not. Perhaps forfeiture can do the work, but I worry that we give up a lot, and not just in terms of our daily emotions with regard to family and friends, or with regard to enjoying books and movies, but with regard to things like the criminal justice system, that desert. I mean, just think even about punishment. How do parents punish children? I mean, even parents punishing children seem to have some sense of proportionality, and you might think that that's tied to desert. So, I mean, desert is really widespread. I mean, it really does affect, real world decisions, not just, how we read novels, or how we understand movies, or how we think about, the various ups and downs in our family and friends' lives.
Yeah, I mean, I think it'll depend on the details. In the sentencing case, I mean, I think you should just try to get figure out which you think will have better outcomes. Um,
To
better
straight
outcomes.
consequentialist. Okay.
Yeah, assuming there's like given that there isn't dessert, don't don't weight the outcomes by.
I mean, one concern I have here is someone might think that the best outcome comes about when we give what would be the proportional punishment. So when we try and track dessert, that's when we achieve the best outcome, even if there's no dessert there. So it could be that, the system gained, we have the most confidence in the system and believe in it if it attempts to track proportion, what would be the sentence that convicted criminals deserve. So in that sense, you're backdooring in dessert, not for itself, but for a way to maximize or bring about the best consequences.
Yeah, and if that's the case, so I mean, what you might think is that if you think that having a belief that sort of acting as if you believed in dessert makes things go better, then you should sort of pretend to believe in dessert, even if
Yeah, and
you
I
don't
and
actually.
I worry about that. I mean, I worry about that because I'm not sure that that's not true. But on the other hand, um, it's fairly troubling that we should sort of try and figure out, well, what would this theory say were it to be true when it's not? I mean, it's an odd route to go down.
I don't know. I mean, I think there are some cases where you might think, um, like if I knew that acting as a deontologist would have better outcomes than acting as a consequentialist, then as a consequentialist, I might say, look, it's worth sort of pretending to be a deontologist because that'll have better outcomes.
But imagine someone thought that so imagine someone's both a judge and a father, and the person says, look, things work best, both the criminal justice system work best in terms of the best consequences, and my household works best if I hand out proportional punishment. And let's just say proportional punishment is equal to the following. It's equal to blame, so B times harm cause H, so B times H, right? Which is something like the equation that Robert Nozick thinks or thought should govern proportional punishment. But blame is always zero. I mean, it's an odd view, right? That you have to say, okay, well, blame is always zero, but what happens if there were blame? We figure out what the value of B would be, and we say, okay, if B did have a value, here's the value of B times H, and then we reason from there. I mean, maybe we can make sense of that, and maybe we can reason in that way. I'm just not confident that we can do that, or even that it makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, what you might just sort of ask, like, okay, what would a normal person who believed in dessert say? So, okay, maybe you don't think anyone's actually blameworthy, but ask, okay, how blameworthy would sort of like most judges say this person is when deciding sentencing, for instance?
Yeah, and perhaps that's what we should do, or maybe not the average person, but the average person who went to University of Michigan, the University of Michigan Law School, right? So someone like what would like a really smart person say about that? So perhaps, but it's kind of an odd thing. It's saying, okay, well, let's imagine that B actually has values, and then figure out what it would be if it were tracking what it's supposed to track, but of course it doesn't track that thing. I mean, you have the same problems with harm, right? I mean, how do you do harm in the case of, when there's like overdetermination of harm, or when you have joint causation? And we could pretend as if you have, discrete causation, and we can make sense of that, but it's not clear that we can. But maybe you're right. I mean, maybe it just has the best consequence if we try and track what the most what a defensible conventional view would say about that.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. I don't have any other questions. Thanks so much for coming on, and it's great. And thanks for listening, everyone.
Okay, it's been a real pleasure. Like I said, I definitely enjoyed being on your show, and I've enjoyed our exchanges elsewhere. So, like I said, if you, yeah, real pleasure. So thank you. And like I said, it's a pleasure to speak to such a superb interviewer and thinker. So thank you.
Well, thank you. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, great. All right.